first started thinking about the topic for this piece, research versus imagination entering the criminal world, it struck me that there are different kinds of research, just as there are different kinds of imagination, and that in looking at the ways in which writers approach the task of creating a believable, authentic-seeming world, criminal or otherwise, it might be useful to consider what these are. As a novelist whose work has spanned quite a range of historical periods, from the 18th century of my last but one novel, Variable Stars, to the early 20th century for my latest book, Line of Sight, the first of a series of detective stories set in the late 1920s, I found myself spending quite a lot of time in libraries. This is both a personal predilection and an absolute necessity, for a writer interested as I am in the way they lived then, to rephrase Trollope's famous formulation. Because the first kind of research I want to look at is the kind you can do sitting at a desk with a stack of books in front of you, or, as in the case of my most recent researches into 1920s London, in newspaper archives. I can't emphasise enough how important this kind of detailed research has been for me in finding a way into the post-war world I'm trying to depict in the novel. For that this was a world profoundly affected by the war is obvious from the minute you pick up a copy of the Times for 1927, the year Line of Sight is set, and read the following. Crawford Smith. In ever-present remembrance of Malcolm Douglas Crawford Smith, late Inns of Court, OTC and RFA, who died March the 1st, 1922, from the effects of gas poisoning in France, 1918. Or this from the same day. Tyne. In proud and loving memory of Captain Christian Tyne, RFC, Royal West Kent Regiment, who gave his life March the 1st, 1918. These and the scores of other no less heartrending notices placed in the columns of the newspaper each year by grieving relatives give some idea of the prevailing mood of the times. No less powerfully evocative of the period are the newspaper reports dealing with crime, then as now telling us a lot about the society in which it occurred. So in August 1927 we read of the execution at Pentonville Prison of John Robinson, the so-called trunk murderer, for the murder of Mrs. Minnie Alice Bonati, whom he killed at an office in Rochester Row where he carried on a business as an estate agent, and whose dismembered body was found in a large black trunk in the cloakroom at Charing Cross Station. From the same month comes this report of an attempted suicide, then regarded as a crime. Stephanie Gray, 43, authoress and journalist, and the widow of a naval commander, living in a top back room in Molyneux Street off Edgware Road, who was in despair because her novel, The Idol, had been rejected by a firm of publishers, attempted suicide by taking a large dose of a German sleeping draught, and has appeared before Mr. Hay Hackett of Marylebone Police Court. Or there's this from the Times of September 1927. Wife acquitted on murder charge. Agnes Smith, otherwise Hill, was found not guilty of the charge of murdering her husband Alexander Hill at their home in Dysart, Fife, by striking him on the head with an axe. The accused testified that her husband had seized her by the throat, placed her on the ground, and put his knee on her chest and threatened to do her in. She was holding a piece of coal and a hatchet at the time and hit him on the back of the head. Accounts of these and no other less lurid crimes are interspersed with snippets of gossip about the Smart Set. A Mardi Gras ball and cabaret was held last night at the Hyde Park Hotel. Amongst those present were the Marchioness of Huntley, the Countess of Plymouth, Viscountess Cave, Viscountess Dupin, Lady Danesford, the Honourable Mrs. Henry Collins and the Honourable Diana Darling. Here too are advertisements for delightful dinner gowns, exact copies of Paris models, made from best quality chiffon, or for the latest wireless sets. Touch a switch and bring the gayest dance bands to your home. You will also find ads for cigarettes. Players always please. 10 for sixpence, 20 for 11pence halfpenny. For furnished villas in Monte Carlo, where only the most aristocratic people go, and for nerve tonic. Does the sound of a motor car backfiring in the street make you jump out of your skin? A nightly dose of Dr. Fuller's powders will set you right. Amongst more sombre articles on the Red Menace and the recent rather worrying fluctuations in the stock market are notices for productions of On Approval at the Fortune Theatre, Lady Luck at the Carlton, The Desert Song at Drury Lane, and One Damn Thing After Another at the London Pavilion. Life, after all, had to go on. Line of Sight isn't specifically a First World War novel, but it does look back to the war and its aftermath. Indeed, its theme might be said to be the effect that war has on those who've had the luck or perhaps misfortune to survive it. The book's central character is Frederick Rowlands, a veteran of the Ypres battlefields, whose life has been irrevocably changed by this experience. Now working as a telephonist for a firm of city solicitors, Fred is caught up in a situation outside his control when he overhears a conversation between his employer and former commanding officer and the woman with whom both are more than a little in love. Has he overheard a confession of murder, or is there a more innocent explanation? From this point on, things become increasingly convoluted as Fred struggles to make sense of the lies and half-truths to which, as a professional eavesdropper, he is privy. As a switchboard operator, Fred listens in to others' conversations as a matter of course. That he doesn't always get things right is no reflection on his intelligence, but says something about the way we're all trying, as readers, as interpreters of our experience, to understand the world from the often partial or imperfect information that comes our way. That the novel had to be a detective story only became clear to me midway through the writing of Line of Sight. As soon as it did, a lot of other things fell into place. Detective fiction reached its zenith as an art form in the so-called Golden Age between the wars, although of course fine examples of the genre continue to be written by Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham and others well beyond the end of the Second World War. But for my purposes, it was the murder mysteries of the late 1920s and early 1930s which gave me the flavour of the times. Most of the research for the novel was done at the London Library, but I did make a research trip to Ypres where my protagonist, a field gunner, whose biography bears more than a passing resemblance to that of my grandfather, Charles Thompson, was wounded in 1917. Which brings me to the other kind of research, the kind you get at first hand, or from talking to someone with experience of what it is you need to know. Visiting the battlefields of Ypres and the Somme was for me a formative experience in the writing of my novel. To be where those soldiers had been and to discover something of what they had undergone during those 4 years was to go some way towards understanding how the novel had to develop. As I've said, the novel isn't about the First World War, but its characters have all been profoundly affected by it, and their actions and reactions only really make sense inside that particular context. In writing about murder, one always has to take into account the social and political context of the crime in any given era. I wasn't being frivolous when I said earlier that the murders of the 1920s and 30s tell us a great deal about the times in which they were committed, just as our own postmodern, post-recession times have thrown up a whole different set of opportunities for this peculiarly personal crime. It doesn't seem to me to be stretching a point to say that the psychological damage suffered by tens of thousands of men and some women as a result of the First World War gave rise to a certain deadening of what we would call the capacity for empathy, which in turn made possible some of the brutal murders of the post-war period. In more recent times it's been called post-traumatic stress and is known to affect the behaviour of returning servicemen and women who have been exposed to intolerable experiences in the combat zone. Then it might have been diagnosed as nerve trouble, if it was diagnosed at all, and treated with Dr. Fuller's powders. Writing detective fiction of whatever era isn't only about trying to understand the psychological profile of your murderer, or indeed your detective, although this is of course extremely important. It's also about getting the details of police and court procedure right as far as possible. Of making your story convincing, in other words. I'm lucky to have as a friend Jill Evans, a distinguished criminal barrister and a member of Geoffrey Robertson's Doughty Street Chambers, who has worked on a number of very high-profile cases at the Old Bailey and elsewhere. Over the years, Jill has offered guidance on a number of tricky legal problems which have arisen in my work, and when she couldn't help directly, has introduced me to someone who could. A few years ago, for example, I was working on a novel set in Jamaica, which centred around a murder committed in the 1970s. A friend of Jill's, Quincy Whitaker, is a barrister specialising in death row cases in the Caribbean. Needless to say, I found her comments on my story invaluable. At Jill's suggestion, I also attended a murder trial at the Inner London Crown Court, at which she was the junior counsel. The presiding counsel for the defence, Edward Fitzgerald QC, had previously defended Rose West. It was a fascinating and occasionally disturbing experience, which taught me a great deal, not only about the way our criminal justice system deals with murder, but about the everyday details of court procedure. I was able to consolidate this knowledge during my jury service at Southwark Crown Court a couple of years later, which was a less gruesome case, but no less fascinating in its own way. These then are some of the different types of research I've employed in writing both my crime fiction and my more ostensibly literary novels. I don't, by the way, see much of a distinction. Because although there's no substitute for reading as widely as you can, books, newspapers, court reports, diaries, shopping lists, you name it, when you're trying to create a world, it's also true that the first-hand research of actually going to see for yourself what a place is like or how the people who live there go about their lives is equally important. I've walked up and down the streets where my characters live, in cities from Edinburgh to Caracas. I've sat in the bars where they drink and stood outside the houses and flats where, in my mind at least, they live and conduct their affairs, which sometimes, of course, include murder. As any reader of crime fiction will know, getting the background details right is crucial when setting up your story. A quick glance at any good detective novel will show you what I mean. Time and again, it's the details of place and the way they're described, as well as the actions of the characters, that determine the mood of the narrative. In fact, it might be argued that place in crime fiction is as important as character. And it's obvious that a lot of writers of this kind of fiction feel the same, often returning again and again to the same setting for successive stories. When we talk of Sherlock Holmes's London, never Conan Doyle's London, we know exactly what we mean. The phrase conjures up a gaslit and foggy city, a place of dark alleys leading who knows where, and hansom cabs clattering off into the night. Or there's Ian Rankin's Edinburgh, with its meticulously described wynds and closes, its seedy pubs and derelict housing schemes, a place for dark deeds if ever there was one. Or John le Carré's Berlin, Colin Dexter's Oxford, George Simenon's Paris. The list goes on. Because in my view, once you've got your setting right, then anything can happen. And I mean anything. Get your background right and your reader will follow you anywhere, whether it's up a creaking staircase into an empty house with a bloody handprint on the wall, or into a brightly lit penthouse apartment where a femme fatale sits waiting with a glass of something cold and sparkling in her hand and murder in her heart. Which brings me to the other element essential for writing any kind of fiction, and the other half of our topic today. I mean imagination. All the research in the world won't be of any use if you can't make it work on the page, by which I mean make your characters and situations come alive for your readers. To do this, you have to enter into the mind of your characters to a greater or lesser extent. They have to come across as real, plausible human beings, and to achieve this, you, the writer, have to believe in them too. So in answer to the question, which is more important, research or imagination, I'd say you can't have one or the other, you have to have both. For while research will give you the substance of your fictional landscape and the details of your characters' lives, only imagination and the power of language will animate this material and make it seem real to others.